My son told me, plain as a kitchen clock, "Dad, you won't be welcome here for Christmas." I closed my eyes, let the words sit like a pebble in my mouth, smiled, more to keep from spitting, and drove straight to the bank. You'd think a sentence like that would come wrapped in heat, that it would be shouted over dishes or slammed out of a door. It was said like a line item, efficient, unemotional, as if he'd been tallying me up for months and finally read the ledger. He said it to my face, sitting on their leather couch, the one with the faded armrest where my wife used to rest her book. It was Isabella who said it, but it was Michael's voice behind her that made the line stick. He'd been watching me from the doorway while their Christmas tree lights blinked like a slow, patient accusation. There was a candle burning on the mantel, good, clean-smelling wax, not the cheap stuff, with a ribbon Isabella had tied herself. Their kitchen had new crown molding and a KitchenAid on the counter, the one I helped buy when they needed a little upgrade. The marble coffee table had a faint ring from a glass. I could see where someone had been careless with a coaster. These were small things, people would say, ornaments of the life I had subsidized, small things that cost more than a copay. If you're hearing this and you like stories where the old man suddenly snaps into villainy, you might press pause here. I'm not that man. I remember how my wife, Maria, used to tie a dish towel around her waist and hum off-key while she made lemon pie. I remember holding her hand in the hospice parking lot, promising we'd be all right. I promised a lot of things after she died. Some of them were for other people. Some of them were for me to sleep through the night. I started making their mortgage payments in March 2018. Not a one-off, not a help until you find your feet thing. It was steady, $2,800 on the 15th like clockwork. I put that on a transfer so it would happen without me thinking, because if I had to keep remembering, I'd find a reason not to. For 5 years, every 15th of the month, money left my account and went into a life that wasn't mine. Do the math with me. $2,800 times 60 payments. That's $168,000. That's a chunk of retirement. That's the difference between sitting comfortably through the winters and worrying about whether the heat pump makes it another season. That's the life insurance cash I dipped into to cover the renovations Isabella convinced me were just necessary updates. A new backsplash, new lighting, a contractor's overestimate that always landed softer when she smiled. I can tell you the dates because men like me hold accounts like habits. Concrete things make the rest of life manageable. The transfers began on the 15th of March 2018. On the ledger of my memory, Maria's last chemo appointment lived beside that date. On the night of the last transfer I made in 2023, I felt something loosen that had been knotted for half a decade. I never announced what I was doing. I hid the paperwork in a drawer with hobby magazines and a pair of old work gloves. I set the transfers up quietly because I didn't want the show of it. There's a cowardice in boasting about your charity. It's also a slow, fossilizing trap. When you pay without saying, people assume it's their due. There were warnings, little ones first, like the way Michael's phone calls got shorter, like the quick looks he and Isabella gave each other when a bill was mentioned. There were conversations that ended with, "Don't worry about it, Dad," which meant, in their language, "Don't make this hard for us." They were always good at shorthand. I was getting older. They were getting impatient. When Michael told me I wouldn't be welcome for Christmas, it wasn't the first time I'd been walled out. It was the first time they told me out loud. It landed, and then the rest of the night stacked itself into a slow, deliberate response. By 9 o'clock, I was back in my car. The leather seat had a small tear where I dropped the screwdriver once. I drove without a destination. The radio hummed an old Sinatra record. I tasted smoke, imagination, and remembered how Maria used to light a cigarette on the porch, then hide the pack in the cookie jar when the grandkids came over. When I got home, I took the envelope from the drawer, the one with years of bank statements, and I didn't measure my actions against a moral rule book. I measured them against the muscle memory of being used. I called the bank and asked them to stop the automatic transfers. I said the word cancel to a woman in a headset and didn't explain myself. There are things that feel like cliff edges. You either step off or keep walking the path until your knees give out. I stepped off. A quick note for those who lean toward nitpicky law books. I won't walk you through how to do it. This is not advice. It was my choice and it carried consequences, legal and otherwise, that I had to be ready for. There was fear in that call, a cold, rational fear, and also a kind of relief I'd not expected. The first month with money back in my account was like breathing after being submerged. I bought ordinary things I had put off. New winter tires, a decent pair of shoes, a jar of olives that weren't on sale. I sat at the marble kitchen counter in my empty house and poured myself a measure of bourbon that made the taste of evenings without explanations a little sweeter. I burned a stack of the old receipts in the sink, only a small fire, controlled. I watched the ash go gray and felt ridiculous and free all at once. It was an act of symbolic closing, not a manifesto. I didn't set it on fire because the paper mattered. I did it because something in me wanted a visible end. There was a second phase to the relief. Money is leverage. Withdrawal of it is not always cruelty.
It's a statement. The week after I stopped the transfers, I filled the freezer with good meat. I paid off a small debt to a former employee who had fixed my gutter. I didn't flaunt any of it. I called Aunt Rosa and told her to come over for a midweek dinner. Rosa, she's the kind of woman who reads the Bible and the classifieds in the same breath, smiled at me over the mashed potatoes and said, "You sound younger." Maybe I did. Then came the pushback. Isabella's voice on the phone was high with panic when she called 2 days after the bank call. "Dad, you have to come pick up my parents from the airport. It's a mess. There's ice, flights canceled, they're here, they landed, and there's nowhere for them to go. You promised." I had not promised to drive to the airport at midnight when the storm was due. I had promised them the mortgage, apparently, in silence and blood. I remember the air in the kitchen that night, the smell of cinnamon from the candle that had been burning since Thanksgiving. I remember asking her if she wanted help getting a taxi or if she'd called a hotel. She sounded like a woman being battered by worry, which was a human thing. Her father, Cody Jenkins, had a bad knee and flew down because Catherine wanted to see the grandkids. That was reasonable. I also remembered how 3 nights earlier, Michael had told me I was not welcome. "Come on, Dad," he'd said, an apology wrapped in a sentence. "It's better this way." He'd said that while he ate a casserole I had bought, while his hands were warm from the oven I had helped pay for. I told Isabella I couldn't. The call was short. She cried. That hurt. But her panic slid into resentment almost immediately. "How can you be?" She stopped and then called me names that would have made Maria laugh because she had never heard Michael swear in front of company. "You're being selfish," she said. "You're leaving us stranded." 2 days later, a local paper ran a piece about a selfish father who left tourists stranded in a blizzard. I recognized the angle before I read the byline. A story that paints an old man as callous is a cheap read. The Harbor Ledger had a neat, pointed photograph of an empty curb at the airport and a shadow that could have been anybody's. The writer was Patricia Morrison, a woman who liked a headline with bite. The piece quoted neighbors, a friend of Isabella's from yoga, and an anonymous tip that the father had chosen himself over family. There was a quote attributed to a source close to the family that made me out to be cold enough to stop hearts. The way these things work is that truth is a messy thing, and headlines are tidy. There were truths in that piece. There were omissions, too. Michael called, furious. Isabella texted me scripture verses about duty and filial obligation, as if that would stitch everything back together. They had friends who amplified the story on social media. The post was shared, liked, then dissected by people who didn't know the family at all. Someone even left a comment on the Ledger site wishing my wife, dead for 5 years, would come back and beat some sense into me. That line cut. There is a peculiar humiliation in being painted as heartless in public when you have given until you bled, metaphorically, for a family. It turns decades of sacrifice into a one-sentence morality play. For a few days, I thought about going back to the account and resuming the payments. I thought about the practicalities, what foreclosure meant, how fast banks moved, and whether I had the energy to argue in court. I thought about being the proud, silent provider who told himself, like a prayer, that blood is thicker than inconvenience. Then I started to collect things. Not in any salacious way, mind you, no furtive digging into locked accounts. I echoed the paper trail I'd lived with for 5 years. Receipts from Home Center showing the backsplash was paid in full on June 12, 2019. Email confirmations from a contractor about crown molding dated September 2, 2020. A bank statement showing a direct deposit to the Jenkins Home Trust on the 15th of every month for the last 60 months. Screenshots of text messages where Isabella asked, with that particular soft pleading she uses, if I could just help out this one time. These were not secrets. These were my proofs. There's a difference between assembling evidence and going on a witch hunt. One is tidy, the other is a funeral. I kept the receipts in a manila folder, then in a thin leather briefcase I found in the back of the closet, the one that had held blueprints years ago when I was still in the trades. I made copies, photographs on my phone, simple things, because paper fades and people misremember. The more I stacked, the clearer the pattern looked. Not just occasional help, but a steady, sustaining thing masquerading as quiet generosity. The more it looked like that, the more certain I became that my continuing to be quiet would be the wrong kind of mercy. There was a moral calculus. Do you keep being the invisible hand supporting a life and accept the deeds of ingratitude? Or do you stop and place the weight of that decision where it belongs? People on the outside tend to zero in on the drama. They want the slam, the public shaming, the reveal. They don't often sit with this. The nights I lay awake thinking about the mortgage officer's voice, the way she said sufficient funds like it was a verdict. The money had been enough for a while. But there is a dignity in being the one who decides when to stop being taken for granted. There is a cost. There is also a relief. A friend asked me later if I felt vindictive. My answer was both more complicated and simpler. I felt vindicted. Vindication is a small, cold almond kind of satisfaction. Revenge is the messy one that leaves you staring at your hands. I was aiming for the former. I prepared a dossier not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I wanted the truth to be legible in the room. If someone is going to portray you as unkind on the front page, then they should be able to see the handwriting of the generosity you gave them, the dates and amounts, the work you did while everyone else ate. I wanted a mirror put on the table. Between the smear piece and Christmas, I became methodical. I cataloged every transfer. I printed bank statements with dates highlighted: March 15, 2018, April 15, 2018, on through to the last payment I had made in November 2023. I listed the contractors and the bills I had cleared. I made a ledger that showed not only the cash, but the way that cash allowed a life that had assumed my loyalty as an unspoken right. I wrote down the small humiliations too. The times Michael called me old when I missed a text about a family gathering. The glances Isabella gave when I offered advice about wiring or faucets. I kept a few of her texts to me that said things like, "We can't afford this without your help," and a couple in which she signed off, "Love you, Dad," as if a phrase could balance a ledger. I also kept things in the briefcase that showed them as humans. A photo of Michael and the kids at the pier last summer where they're all laughing, shoes in the sand. A receipt from a small bakery where Isabella had ordered cupcakes for Catherine's birthday. Cody's boarding pass stub from the trip when he had aggravated his knee and needed a ride home. People are not villains because they forget the value of what was given to them. They're people. They forget. They act out of fear, embarrassment, laziness, the same catalog I have of my own failings. Planning was less cinematic than I'd imagined. It wasn't cloak and dagger. It was me, sitting in my den with a pen light and the television murmuring, sorting pages into piles. Payments, renovations, textual evidence, small kindnesses. Each pile told a slightly different story. Together they spelled something that, I hoped, would be harder to ignore than a column in the ledger. There were practical considerations, of course. If you stop paying someone's mortgage, there's a legal process that doesn't end overnight. Banks send letters. Notices arrive in yellow envelopes that smell like bureaucracy. Foreclosure is not a hammer you swing lightly. It's a slow, patient machine. I didn't relish the thought of Michael losing his home. I wasn't trying to do unto him what he'd done unto me. I was drawing a line and letting the rest fall where it must. People argue about intention and outcome, but in the end, both matter. The week before Christmas, Patricia Morrison called. She wanted to know more. Some readers say you intentionally left family members stranded, she said, in that clipped way reporters do when they think they're holding the exposed nerve. I told her, as much as I was willing, about the transfers.
I told her I had been helping for 5 years. She asked for documentation. I told her I'd be in touch. When she ran the second piece, a more complicated column this time, with numbers and dates, it wasn't the vindication I'd imagined at first. It complicated things. The ledger ran a follow-up showing my side alongside quotes from Cody and Isabella, who said, in tones both hurt and defensive, that they'd been worried about how it would feel for them to accept help publicly. They claimed privacy. They claimed shame. They claimed entitlement didn't enter the equation. That line cut differently. A few of their friends came forward with anecdotes about how, yes, they sometimes asked for help, but nobody had expected a complete cut to happen. Some readers felt I had overstepped. Others wrote to me to say they had been in similar positions and understood wanting to stop. The internet is a town square where everybody speaks at once and nothing resolves. I remember the night I decided to confront them, though confront is an ugly word. I decided to bring the briefcase to their house on Christmas Eve, to sit at their table, to place a packet at each setting with copies of the statements and receipts, and let people read what had actually happened. I told myself, mostly honestly, that I wanted them to know the truth before they read a headline and turned that truth into a story that left me as the villain. Part of me wanted drama. Another part wanted a quiet correction of the record. Most of me wanted to see, in their faces, whether they recognized the years I had poured out for them. I found myself thinking about how this would look. The briefcase in my lap like an old man's Bible, the scuffed leather catching the light from the chandelier. Plates with cranberry sauce would be ringing quiet. Children would dart under the table. Someone would crack a joke that would break the tension by accident. I imagined Isabella's face when she saw the money columns. I imagined Michael's jaw tightening. I imagined Cody and Catherine speechless. I also imagined nothing. That possibility was the one that made me tighten my grip on the handle the night I packed the dossiers. There would be no applause. There might be anger. There might be accusations of public shaming. There might be the slow, suffocating silence that cuts better than any word. You don't get to plot out the exact moral geometry of a family like you do a crossword. There are unknowns and histories and the small, weird loyalties families have. I carried that briefcase like a statement. It was heavier than I expected. On December 23rd, I drove to Rosa's and told her what I planned. She didn't ask me to stop. She made me coffee and said, "If it has to be done, do it with your back straight." Rosa's language is blunt and tender in the same sentence. We ate, and she told me stories about Maria I hadn't heard. The raw edges of memory she smoothed into warmth. It steadied me. That night, I set the alarm on my phone for an hour earlier than usual. I took a shower and put on the jacket Maria used to say made me look less tired. I put the briefcase in the trunk and stood in the driveway for a long time, cigarette lit, thinking about the first time Michael held his son, how he trembled like a man discovering the planet for himself. History is full of paradoxes.
We build our own prisons sometimes. I drove with the radio off. The town was quiet, the kind of deep winter quiet where your car sounds different, as if it's speaking just to you. There were string lights in some windows. Someone had a wreath that had seen better years. I parked half a block away, as if that would make my arrival less theatrical. It didn't. The house beamed with familiarity, warm light through curtains, the silhouette of someone moving in the kitchen. In the window there was a small sign that said Feliz Navidad in felt letters. Someone had hung it with love. I stood there for a long time with my hand on the briefcase, listening to myself breathe, thinking about the slow economy of care, what I've given, what they took for granted, what they believed they earned. I thought about Maria's laugh, the way it filled a room and left it slightly cleaner. I thought about being that man at the door who either walks in and sits down or turns and drives away. Then I closed the trunk and walked toward their porch. The wood creaked the way porches do in old houses, honest and tired. My knuckles smacked the door and I felt my heart go twice as loud as usual. Through the window I could see motion, the clink of plates, a flash of a sweater. Someone moved toward the door. I hesitated there, very conscious of my breathing. There was a moment, a sliver, where every decision hung like an icicle ready to drop. I could see the room in my mind, the chandelier like a small sun, the briefcase under my arm, the packets at each place, the faces of the people who had loved me or had the capacity for it, spinning into new shapes. I had prepared what I would say. I had rehearsed the small, precise sentences that would not be a tirade, but a ledger, dates, amounts, choices. I had bracketed it with the thing I wanted them to remember. Not that I wanted their money back, not that I wanted to make them suffer, but that I wanted to be visible in the life they had built on my labor. A car came down the street, and the headlights skimmed the snow. For a second I thought about driving away, about staying home with Rosa in the quiet, unentertained peace of it, about not pulling a briefcase out and turning a holiday into a courtroom. For a second I thought about how good my bourbon tasted the night I stopped the payments, how light my pockets felt. Then the door opened. Isabella's face was a small, tight thing, lit from within by emotion I could not name, anger, fear, apology. Michael was behind her, jaw set, the kids at his side, a little one clinging to his leg. Cody and Catherine followed slowly, Catherine with a scarf looped a little too tight under her chin. The house smelled of rosemary and roasting something that wouldn't be ruined by the news I carried. "I didn't come to ruin Christmas," I said. My voice sounded like a man who had rehearsed and also had no other words. "I came to make the ledger plain." "I told you not to," Isabella said, and there was more hurt than accusation in it. "I told you we could handle this." "I handled it for you for 5 years," I said, and the sentence landed like a tool that had been used until worn. "You made a life off of it. You made a life off of me." Michael's face was unreadable for a moment. "You could have talked to us," he said. "You could have told us you were done." "I did," I told him. "It was never about the missing words, Michael. It was about what stopped being offered." We stood there like that, in the doorway. The night pressed thin around us. Plates clanked inside. A child giggled at something I couldn't see. The briefcase under my arm was suddenly heavy with knowing. I stepped inside. And that's where the room changes. The air bends toward people. The chandelier catches the dust like it normally does. The moment you have been building toward has a gravity that doesn't yield to plan. People look at one another. Phones are hidden. Conversations stall. There is an expectant silence that is almost holy in its awkwardness. I sat at the head of the table like a man who had been invited and not invited, and I set the briefcase on the floor by my chair. I cleared my throat and reached for the first packet, palms steady but aware of how steady they were sounding. I slid the first folder, payments, toward Michael, who lifted an eyebrow and then, reluctantly, unfolded the pages. The look on his face when he saw the first highlighted date was not the triumph I had imagined. It was more complicated: embarrassment, a dawning recognition, an old, cold regret. Isabella's hand trembled on the back of the chair. Cody's mouth opened and then closed, like someone trying to keep a song from leaking out. Catherine put a hand to her heart. We sat like that, the dossier between us, the house filled with the quiet ripple of things you only see after you stop pretending. I felt something loosen inside me that had nothing to do with the payments. A small, honest breathing space where clarity lived. They read. The kids spilled milk and no one admonished them. The chandelier glowed. I watched Michael's forehead fold, and then the doorbell rang. It was a late knock, a sound that shattered the room's fragile concentration. My hand closed on the back of my chair, like a man bracing for an imbalanced step. The door opened and a woman stood there, a reporter's badge inconspicuous in her coat. Her presence changed the temperature of the space. Patricia, Isabella said, the name flattening the air. Patricia Morrison smiled, polite, practiced. I heard there was a gathering, she said, voiced the same she used when someone waved cash across a page. Thought I'd check in. The room grew smaller. I thought about the headline she would write, the way she had written before, tidy and sharp. I remembered the ledger's first piece and the second, the way numbers could be wielded as scalpel or cudgel. I imagined her pen moving now, translating the bread on the table and my briefcase into something that would settle in other people's minds. For a second, I admitted, I considered closing the briefcase and walking out. There is bravery in retreat as well. But I had come this far. I had set the dates and the sums in order. I had taken the risk. The doorbell had rung regardless. The story did not stop for the things I preferred. Isabella said something to Patricia in a low voice, which Patricia recorded with a small, polite nod. Cody made a small motion as if to stand, then sat again. Michael looked at me the way sons sometimes do at fathers, part anger, part plea. The kids began to fight over a paper ornament someone had left on the table. Life continued among the counting. When Patricia took a seat at the end of the table, notebook poised, I realized with a kind of tired clarity that there was no way to control how this would be read by strangers. There was only the truth on the pages and the way it landed in the room. "Why now?" she asked, not unkindly, but with that itch reporters have to make everything a simple cause. "What's your point in bringing this here tonight?" My answer was steadier than I felt. "My point," I said, "is to make visible what has been invisible. I'm tired of being quiet so other people can be comfortable calling that quiet a sin." She nodded and wrote. The kids oddly grew silent, as if they understood that something adult and dangerous was being traded on the table. I realized how many small hands had been guided by money I had supplied for years, how many choices had been made and then folded into lives that would now have to reckon. I set the next packet in front of Isabella. It had her text asking for help, highlighted dates next to the sums I had moved. She sniffed. The sound made my mouth unfamiliar with itself. Michael put his hand to his forehead and leaned back. "There are consequences to this," Cody said quietly, voiced like a man thinking about his knee and then about how to apologize. "Yes," I agreed, "there are consequences." The room inhaled. Outside, the streetlights turned, making ribbons on the snow. In that pause, with the briefcase open and the documentary proof laid out like accusing angels, I felt something I had not wanted to feel at the start, the true cost of my decision. But some things are necessary to see. Some truths need the quiet of a dining room, the rough, honest light of family looking at its own accounting. I had expected anger. I had expected denials. I had expected tears. I had not expected Patricia to make notes so delicately, as if she were preserving memories. Maybe that was her talent. Maybe it was her trap. We had not yet reached what would become the point of no return. The packets were read, the children fidgeted, the chandelier hummed. I could see Michael's jaw working like a machine trying to catch up with conscience. A sound at the window made me look up. Snow had started again, small feathers falling, making the world soft at the edges. It felt obscene and also strangely like liturgy. I had one more packet to place on the table, the last one that summarized everything in a way only numbers can do. It was the ledger that would make clear what had been given and what had been taken as a birthright. I reached for it, felt the paper's cool edge, and then paused. There are moments in life when you realize you will cause pain no matter what you choose. You also realize that sometimes pain is the clarifying light through which people see themselves. I sat with that balance, heavy and clear, and I let the room watch me decide. The packet landed on Michael's plate with a soft, deliberate thud. He opened it. His face, for a moment, registered the arithmetic of love and convenience in their purest, unadorned form. Something in him, pride, maybe, or shame, moved. Then someone at the head of the table knocked a glass. A child's laughter, thin and bright, cut the tension and almost made us all laugh with it. The ledger, the briefcase, the reporter at the end of the table, these were the adult scaffolding of a scene whose center was, still, the family. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, the chandelier glowed against faces that were suddenly more human than headline ready. And in that place, with the packet spread and the truth laid out, I felt the future tilt toward consequences I had considered and toward reckonings I could not fully predict. I had stepped over a line into a room that would not be the same when I left. The decision had been made, and the first domino had fallen. I had no idea then of the notices that would come in the mail months later, the legal letters that would arrive like winter bills, or of the way Michael would come to my door later, hat in hands, asking forgiveness. I didn't yet have all of that in my hands. I had only the briefcase, the ledger, the faces, and a winter night stretching itself into whatever would follow. For now we sat and read and listened, and the chandelier hummed. The rest, how they would respond, how the town would talk, how the bank would move, was unwritten. I set my hand on the briefcase, steadying myself for what I had set in motion. The room watched. The reporter wrote. The snow fell. The packet lay open between Michael's fingers, and for the first time in years, numbers and memories met where they belonged. The room stayed that way for a long time. People reading, hands hesitating, snow tightening the world beyond the windows. Patricia wrote with her head cocked, as if every line could be coaxed into a neat narrative. Cody breathed in and out like someone who'd just been handed a verdict. Isabella's face had gone a color that made the room look raw, the color of someone who'd been unmasked in public and found the mirror disagreeable. No one shouted. No one slammed a dish. There were sharp words, short, dull things like thrown pebbles, but nothing cinematic. Family scenes usually are less dramatic than we imagine. They are quieter and meaner in small ways. Michael rubbed his eyes and said, "Dad, you could have told us," with the slow, rehearsed sorrow of someone trying to make a confession sound like a plea. The kids shuffled their feet and stared at the pages, which seemed to them more like homework than accusation. Patricia stood to leave first, polite as a surgeon. "I'll be careful," she said. "I'll tell it how it is." I did not expect tenderness from her. I expected professionalism. I had also learned, watching the ledger in the last weeks, that how it is often depends on which pieces you choose to show. After she closed her notebook and slid her pen into her pocket, the room felt smaller. A chair scraped. Someone laughed nervously. The family argued a little and then not. They closed ranks in a way that suggested pride was not yet entirely dead, only injured. That night I drove home beneath the same quiet stars. Briefcase in the trunk and the sound of the heater more companionable than it had been when I'd arrived. The car smelt faintly of rosemary from whatever they'd roasted. My hand steadied on the wheel in a way I didn't recognize. Acts of confrontation make you feel old and new at once. I had expected triumph or horror or some tidy resolution. What came was an odd exhaustion and the sense that I'd done, finally, the thing I owed myself. The ledger's piece ran the next morning. Patricia did what she always did. She told a story with proper nouns and dates and let the town decide which side of the ledger it liked. The headline folded the nuance into a neat fold. Local father halts mortgage support, family in dispute, which is not the same thing as villain. It was cleaner than the first chunk of outrage had been, and meaner in a different way, because the numbers were there, and numbers have a staccato honesty that silence never does. The reaction split the town like light through a prism. Some people sent notes. Old guys from the PO who remembered me when I still fixed roofs, neighbors who'd had to choose between eating or fixing a car and who recognized the logic of stopping. A woman I didn't know left a card on my stoop that said, simply, "You did the hardest thing." Someone else said I was cold. Of course. Men like me get both labels depending on the angle. Isabella did not speak to me for a week. She left voicemails that started soft and ended sharp. Michael texted, then asked to meet 2 days later at a coffee shop that felt neutral, the way a borrowed sweater feels neutral. I went because I wanted to hear what he would say when he had to be the man who had been irresponsible and also frightened. We met in a place where the espresso machine hissed like a horse and the heat made art out of everyone's breath. He ordered black coffee and didn't drink it. He had aged a few years. That part of fatherhood shows up in the face. He looked at me, not with the wildness of battle, but with the more dangerous thing, something like a plea and a calculation mingled. "You changed everything," he said. "You didn't have to." "I did," I told him. "You'd already told me I wasn't welcome." He flinched. "We were embarrassed. We didn't know how to." "How to what? Say thank you?" I asked gently. "Ask my advice? Give me a place at the table?" He looked down at his cup like a boy caught with a jar of marbles. "I didn't know how to admit we were getting help," he said. "It felt private, shameful maybe." "Shame is a strange currency," I said. "You treat it like a coin you can say you're paying with, but it's not currency. It's a weight. You used my money to lift that weight. That's a different thing." He put his hand over the table, palms up. I know, He looked like a man running out of words. "I screwed up, Dad." "Maybe," I said. "Maybe you did, but there's more than one way for us to move forward." He licked his lips. "Can you—" He stopped and started again like an engine trying to catch. He started again like an engine trying to catch. "Can you help us with options? I'm not asking you to take over things, but—" He didn't finish the sentence, and he didn't need to. There was plenty left between us. The important thing was what I said next. "I'll help you figure out how to stand on 2 feet if you want," I told him. "I'll help you look at the ledger. I'll sit with you at a meeting if you need me to. But I'm not going back to being the automatic bill payer. I am not your safety net forever." His face split with a sort of gratitude that was more fearful than relieved. "That's fair," he said quietly. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I said, for the way I shut you out. I should have." "You should have listened," I said. That sounded harsher than I wanted, but it was true. He nodded and looked like he might have cried, which is a small, private redemption for both of us. When he left, he hugged me, not in a showy way, but like a man who needed the contact of his father's shoulder. He promised small things. He promised to respond. He promised to try. Promises in a coffee shop are not contracts, but they are a start. Then the mail began to arrive in earnest. Banks don't send menacing notices in person. They send letters with polite language, envelopes stamped with official ink, and a smell of corporate sternness. The first one came 3 months after the transfer stopped, a certified letter that had a formal crispness. My hands felt like someone else's when I slit the flap. The notice said, in measured, bureaucratic tones, that the account had fallen into arrears and that unless payment was made, the bank might proceed with foreclosure actions. It was not a single thunderclap. It was a series of small, relentless knocks. I remember the exact look of the envelope. Brown, heavy, the word notice stamped in bold. I set it on the marble counter like a thing that could be admired for its typography. I did not laugh. I also did not dance in triumph. There is a moral hazard in celebrating someone's misfortune, even when that misfortune is a consequence of their own choices. I had not stopped payments to hurt my son the way he had hurt me. I'd stopped them to keep from being treated as invisible. But consequences have a way of landing in rooms and on mailboxes and in the lives of small kids who have no say in these economies. That fact gave me no joy. It gave me a deep, stubborn responsibility to hold the line without becoming cruel. The foreclosure notices became a chapter in our story. Michael called and asked what letters he would find in the mail and whether I had a copy of the payments I had made, which I had. He asked, halting and ashamed, if we could meet the next week and go through the numbers together. I said yes. I did not invite him into my account. I invited him to the table where we could talk through the arithmetic of his life and how to make some small, honest changes. He accepted in a voice that was thinner than the one he'd used when he was younger and braver. There were other small, practical things. He started taking on more shifts at the shop. Isabella picked up a part-time catering gig she had been meaning to try. Cody, embarrassed by his own presence in the story, offered to sell his boat and use the proceeds to help bridge a month or two. Pride is a heavy thing to swallow. It makes men ornery in different ways. Michael swallowed a fair bit. The town, which had been a chorus of outrage and sympathy, began to hush into a quieter judgment that understood complexity. People who had removed themselves from the conversation because it was messy began to say, in careful voices, that they understood both sides. A man I had worked with on a roof in '96 came over and said, "You did what your conscience told you," and left without comment. A neighbor, Mrs. Crenshaw, brought over a casserole and said, "Boundaries are a kind of courage," in the same tone you use for stating the weather. Small kindnesses that don't make the ledger ran as threads through the weeks. Isabella and I talked again eventually. It was not a graceful call. It was two people circling a wound and trying to measure how far the edges were gone. She said, little by little, that I'd been a safety she hadn't intended to rely on, and that when I stopped, she felt abandoned. It was as if everything we built was suddenly in the air, she said. But it was our choice to use what you offered.
I know that now. Good, I said. Know it before you ask again. She laughed in a way that was not bitter. You are unforgiving, she said, and I recognized it as a compliment, in a strange way. I told her that forgiveness is not the same as enabling. I told her there are times when love looks like walking away from a role you've played for too long because it suits other people more than it suits your dignity. Months passed, and life rearranged itself in small, stubborn ways. The kids grew into new rhythms, less pizza ordered because the pantry was suddenly a place they had to stock themselves. There were awkward evenings when they stayed over at my house because Michael had to stay late at the shop, and the youngest liked my recliner better than the one at home with the worn armrest. Small things happen when big things shift. You either grimace at the change or you adjust the chair and make a cup of tea. The ledger ran another piece a few weeks later, this one longer and less venomous. Patricia had done what good reporters do. She chased nuance and came up with both. She printed my ledger and some of Isabella's explanations, and she printed a short note from the bank explaining what foreclosure meant in principle and practice. The town read it and decided, in groups and clusters, what it meant to each of them. There were consequences I hadn't predicted. Contractors called, surprised to be contacted by a paper noting they had been paid. Friends who had treated me as an invisible ATM before stood in my doorway with a look I didn't like. Being visible has costs. But there were also small gifts. An invitation to a community woodworking class, which I thought I wouldn't like and then loved. The simple pleasure of old hands shaping new things. I took a class one cold evening in March and found that the shavings smelled like memory and work and something I was able to share. And then the thing I had not wanted to happen happened. The bank sent a formal notice of intent with dates and legal phrasing that read like a different language. It did not say you are evil or you are wrong. It said in careful sentences, unless payments are made by X date, the lender may initiate foreclosure proceedings. Hannah from the bank, who had previously been the woman answering the phones, signed the letter with a regards. There was a professionalism in it that felt almost compassionate. Michael came by the house that evening with the kids and the air of a man who had rehearsed humility. He stood on my porch with his hands visible and said, I've come to the part of the story where I ask for help that isn't taking your money away. His hat was in his hands. There was a little smear of grease on one sleeve. He looked tired in a way that felt like repair work. We sat at my Formica table and he said plainly, Dad, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said what I did. I was ashamed and I took it out on you. I don't expect you to undo it. Good, I said. Then let's talk about what you can do. We don't need theatrical promises. We need work and honesty. We did not bargain over the mortgage. I did not offer to restart the payments. I won't say there wasn't a point of private temptation. There is always that, because I am flesh and numbers. But I had decided that enabling in the name of love had become a religion that ate up my peace. I had read those pages of my life and seen the margins where my name had been erased. Instead, I offered him something practical in a way that didn't constitute legal counsel or storm his dignity. I offered to help him with the paperwork of his own life in a presence I could maintain without violating the line I'd drawn. I'll help you set up a meeting with an advisor, I said. I'll be there when you make the call if you want me to sit with you. I'll help watch the kids when you need to go to paperwork. But I will not resume the automatic transfers. Not now, not if the ledger is to remain honest. We talked for hours, which is to say that we sat and chewed on details and on the soft plates of things that had been broken. He told me about calls he'd ignored, apologies he hadn't made, times he'd rationalized. I told him about nights sitting on the porch, crying for Maria, and wondering if being the silent provider had been my way of making sure someone was cared for, even when I couldn't fix it. We both said things we would regret and things we would be grateful for later. He left that night with a small packet of things I had photocopied for him. Nothing new, nothing theatrical, but arranged so the numbers made sense once someone cared to read them. He hugged me on the porch and, for the first time in a long time, asked if I'd be around the next week for movie night with the kids. No ledger, he said, smiling, just pizza. Grandpa gets the recliner. I said yes. Forgiveness came in fits. One day there would be an apology. 2 days later, a text that felt passive-aggressive. A week later, a casserole on my doorstep because Isabella had wanted to say something that couldn't be said in words. That is how families negotiate repair. Not in one tidy ceremony, but in a clunky, stubborn series of small human exchanges. There were other people who did not forgive easily. Some argued that I had weaponized my generosity. Others said I had set a necessary boundary. I had to live with both narratives because adults must live with multiple truths. The community chose its sides quietly and then moved on, as towns do. The Ledger ran letters to the editor, one accusing me of cruelty and another thanking me for finally taking care of myself. Both were true in whatever rung of human experience they sat on. One unexpected thing happened 6 months later. Michael came to my door, hat in hand, and asked if I'd come to his son's school play. It's Saturday, he said. He wants his granddad there. No ledger, he said, smiling. Just pizza. Grandpa gets the recliner. I said yes. Forgiveness came in fits. One day there would be an apology. 2 days later, a text that felt passive-aggressive. A week later, a casserole on my doorstep because Isabella had wanted to say something that couldn't be said in words. That is how families negotiate repair. Not in one tidy ceremony, but in a clunky, stubborn series of small human exchanges.
There were other people who did not forgive easily. Some argued that I had weaponized my generosity. Others said I had set a necessary boundary. I had to live with both narratives because adults must live with multiple truths. The community chose its sides quietly and then moved on, as towns do. The Ledger ran letters to the editor, one accusing me of cruelty and another thanking me for finally taking care of myself. Both were true in whatever rung of human experience they sat on. One unexpected thing happened 6 months later. Michael came to my door, hat in hand, and asked if I would come to his son's school play. "It's Saturday," he said. "He wants his granddad there."
I felt something like a tug then, a small, honest wanting that had nothing to do with money. "Yes," I said, "I will be there." The play was a short, clumsy thing with mismatched costumes and too bright stage paint. A child who was half Michael and half Isabella ran across the stage like they had ignition, and the audience laughed in the places the director intended and in the places the kids improvised. When Michael's son saw me in the crowd, he lit up in a way that made me forget both the ledger and the letters. He ran into my arms after the final bow and hugged me so hard I felt my ribs flex. For a moment, everything else was quiet and good. We did not resume old patterns. We didn't need to. The small, steady work of being present, taking a kid to soccer practice, fixing a leaky faucet when called, showing up for school events, became a different grammar of care. It was less expensive and less tied to humiliation. It required me to put up with some awkwardness and to be patient when Michael made mistakes. He did. We both did. That was fine. I kept taking short woodworking classes and made a set of bookends for Rosa. She cried like someone who knows the shape of gestures and appreciates them even when they are crude. "You look younger," she said again, over mashed potatoes that tasted like tradition. I liked when she said that. It meant I had muscle enough to be useful and spirit enough to be amused. There were nights I replayed the dinner, how Patricia had sat at the end of the table, how the snow had feathered the windows, how the children had spilled milk. There were imaginary moments I held and polished like coins, a future where Michael would meet hardship head-on and grow, a future where Isabella would say what she felt without hiding, a life where my name wasn't the silent footnote, but the actual author of a sustained presence. The town's conversation shifted again when the bank moved more formally. In a quiet, bureaucratic rhythm, the notices multiplied and Michael had to take action. I did not tell him what to do because that would have been overreach. Instead, I sat with him through phone calls and letters in my kitchen where the kettle sang and the light bent the dust motes like tiny, slow planets. I offered moral clarity and an older man's patience. I also offered tools of my own life, a friend at the hardware store who could recommend a small, reliable contractor, a neighbor who taught bookkeeping as a second trade and who would talk to Michael about cash flow without making him feel small. One afternoon, as summer was turning, Michael knocked on my door and handed me a letter with a hand that was more steady than it had been months before. He had a faint smile. "They sent a notice," he said. "They're willing to negotiate something. We might be able to figure out a plan." "Good," I said. "Then do that." He squeezed my shoulder and went home. I watched him go and thought about how people change in tiny increments, not like overnight miracles, but the slow, patient work of habit. He had to carry consequences. I had to carry the knowledge that my stopping the payments had been the first domino. I carried that with both regret and a fierce, honest satisfaction that I'd reclaimed a part of myself. This is where the moral of the story gets complicated, because there is no tidy heroism in drawing a line and then watching the world shift. There is only living with the consequences and the small, brave acts that follow. I did not cause Michael's hardship to punish him. I caused it because my life was also at stake. My dignity, my sense of meaning, the late-life peace one hopes to buy with small, steady choices. When consequences followed, I did not cheer.
I held my hand to my chest and listened to my own breathing and hoped whatever came next would be a hard lesson landed clean. Over the next year, we settled into a new grammar of family. I was present but not all-consuming, available but not a vault to be used. I attended birthdays and school plays. I fixed the downstairs gutter when it leaked and took the boys fishing on the rare weekend they could be spared. We ate dinners where we sometimes argued and sometimes laughed. We were, imperfectly, living. There was a day I remember, late summer, when Michael brought his kids to my backyard and we set up a small fire pit. The kids roasted marshmallows until they burned and then proudly presented them to their parents, which is what children do. They produce small joys and offer them up with trust. Isabella came out at one point and brought coffee for me and a bowl of berries for the kids. Her smile that night was not perfect, but it was easier than it had been. We spoke about renovations in careful terms, but then decided to let the house be for a while. Patricia wrote another piece some months later about the complicated shapes of family support, which some people read and used to excuse themselves, and others read and felt chastened. I met her once after a church service, and we spoke like people who recognized the limitations of the words we had. "You did what you thought you needed to," she said. "We all do that." I said nothing because the sentence was long enough. I live now in a way that feels lighter and more honest. I visit Rosa every week. I go to the little woodworking class and teach an 18-year-old how to use a plane without losing his thumb. I drink coffee that isn't hurried. I pick up a grandchild occasionally and take him to the pier where he learns the delicate art of throwing a stone just so. In these small acts, there's a soft contentment that has nothing to do with ledgers. Sometimes people ask me if I regret it. The question is blunt and kind of mean, because it assumes regret is a single thing you can name. I answer honestly. I regret that my choices caused pain to children who did not understand the accounting of grown people. I do not regret that I finally told the truth about what I'd done and what I would no longer do. Regret and resolve can live in the same sentence. People also ask if I tried to get my money back, as if families operate like banks. That's not how it works. Money is not a ledger line that erases relationships. It leaves traces. It changes how people move in the world. I had no expectation of repossessing memories or design choices. What I wanted was visibility, respect, and an end to being treated as a bottomless resource. I want to be clear, because there are lines that should not be blurred. This is my story, told so other people might see the shape of a choice. It is not advice. I do not counsel anyone to take legal or financial action based on it. I will say this: when you give, make sure you are giving what you can afford to lose, because gratitude is as fragile a thing as anything else. Months turned into a year. The foreclosure notices quieted when Michael got an arrangement that didn't require my resuming the transfers. He worked harder. Isabella found a small catering niche and took some pride in how her cakes won local contests. Cody and Catherine sold a boat and used the proceeds to cover a few months. There were small acts of restitution people made that did not require my sanction. They came from the shape of regret and the practicalities of parenting and pride. At times, I still feel the old ache for Maria. There are afternoons I sit in the chair she liked, a small hand passing a biscuit to my knee, and I taste lemon pie in memory. Those moments are soft and expensive in their tenderness. They provide a kind of ballast. A year after I placed the briefcase on the table, Michael came over and helped hang a bookshelf I had bought from a friend. We worked in companionable silence for most of it. When we finished, he stayed and drank an extra cup of coffee. "You saved me," he said at one point, and I looked at him because the sentence seemed off-kilter to me. "Saved you how?" I asked. "Not with money," he said, "with a chance to be better. You made me take responsibility." He poked his finger at the shelf where the books gleamed. "And you showed up last year. You came even when you were told not to." I had thought at the start that the hardest part would be not being invited, not being wanted at a table in December with tinsel in a tiny tree. There is a smaller and stranger pride in being the man who will not be an invisible account. Coming to terms with that was its own education. I had shown up that Christmas Eve with a briefcase and an old man's steady hands. I had chosen visibility over silence, and the cost of that choice had been higher than I wanted and also right in a way that feels like healing. If there is a moral, perhaps it is this: families are economies of love and cost, and no ledger alone can describe the exchanges. There are times when the most loving thing you can do is stop being complicit in a pattern that eats you. There are other times when love looks like steady payment, silent and abiding. The tricky, terrible work of living is in deciding which is which for your life, with a clear conscience and an eye on the consequences. The last line of the story, if stories have last lines, comes back to the beginning. My son thought I wouldn't be welcome for Christmas. He said the words, certain and clean. I heard them and did a thing he hadn't expected. I stopped being the invisible purser of their life. I did not do it because I wanted him to lose anything. I did it because I needed to stop losing myself. In the end, I did show up, not as an ATM, not as a footnote. I showed up as something more complicated, a man who had limits and the courage to name them. We rebuilt the relationship on smaller, truer terms. Less money, fewer silent absolutions, more presence that required nothing but time and sometimes a screwdriver. It is not perfect. It never was, but it is real. If this story resonated with you, if you've known what it is to be taken for granted or to take courage to say no, please like, subscribe, and share. Tell us in the comments, would you have done the same?